Hi everyone, my name is John. Welcome back to my channel. It is January 19th, 2022, and I wanted to review a book for you I read with a couple of friends last year. The reading group kind of fell apart for a couple of different reasons. One of the members got sick, another one was in the middle of trying to sell her house when we decided to read it, so it might have been doomed from the beginning. But I wanted to give it a review. So those two people, by the way, were Peg from the History Shelf and Bill Rutenberg from Bill Rutenberg's library, who I'm sure everyone knows. The book that we read together is John Meacham's biography of Thomas Jefferson, called Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. Despite the hundreds of biographies, maybe thousands of biographies that have been written about Jefferson since his death in 1826, it still attracts, his life and presidency still attracts the attention of people who think that they have something interesting and unique to say about him. That is hopefully the point of writing another book about him. In the past, John Meacham has written popular biographies of other American presidents, including George H.W. Bush and Andrew Jackson, as well as a book on the friendship between FDR and Winston Churchill. Needless to say, the territory anyone who writes on these popular subjects has chosen out to carve for themselves is kind of tough, because one, the material that they have at hand is kind of well worn. So unless you're completely a newcomer, you're probably not learning a terribly new amount of information. So the author needs to do a couple of things. They need to maintain a lively, engaging prose style while they tell the narrative. Usually not a problem for John Meacham. He tends to be a pretty gifted writer. And hopefully shed some new light on the material at hand. Give a new angle on what's going on. Like I said, the first point with John Meacham, the writing is clear, is empathetic. It's compulsively readable. Even for someone who's not quite sure that they would want to read, how long is this? It was, well, with the notes, it's 750 pages long, but without them, it's more like 500. So there are a lot of notations in the back. Well, this is my first Thomas Jefferson biography, I should say. I had all the small sort of prepackaged facts that anyone educated in the United States would probably know about Jefferson. He was the third president. He was responsible for the Louisiana Purchase and the expedition of Lewis and Clark, and died on the same day as John Adams, just a few hours after him, who was his bitter rival during the election of 1800, on the 50th anniversary of July 4th, 1776, which was July 4th, 1826, etc. But beyond this, I didn't really have too much of... I am not the history nerd that Bill and Peg are when it comes to the American presidency or American history. I tend to... My affinities tend to be drawn to European history more. But I thought that, I would read this and probably have something to learn. The subtitle, The Art of Power, comes about from John Meacham's insistence on emphasizing Jefferson's careful pragmatism and his diplomacy at critical points in his career. Other stories of Jefferson's life have portrayed him as a cool, philosopher or statesman whose decisions have been sort of objective ratiocinations of a mind weaned on Enlightenment ideals. Meacham's tack on Jefferson's life, however, is that he understood the importance of personal relationships and friendships in the quotidian role of just everyday politics, and especially when it meant to getting something accomplished. The one glaring example, I think probably everyone knows about it, comes from those set of, facts that you get in school, was the attempted effort by Benjamin Rush to reach out to Jefferson and Adams both and rekindle their, if not their friendship, at least their correspondence. And it's not until about, I think, 1812 or 1813, they needed a cooling off period of about a dozen years after that election back in 1800. It was one heck of an election, and it was very, 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 very contentious, and they hated one another, probably for a good long time. But they decided that having a correspondence for the purpose of being enjoyed by posterity would benefit everyone, because both people thought that Jefferson and Adams both thought that the open-air exchange of ideas was more important than the sometimes deeply satisfying bitterness of personal resentment. Imagine that. But it is important to note that in accepting Jefferson's offer, Adams too showed the same pragmatism and selflessness. It was, after all, a day and age where people were able to readily admit that some principles were bigger than themselves. No more, but that was true once. Meacham also avoids the cardinal sin of dozens of modern presidential biographies in that it avoids the events or avoids talking around the implications of contemporary politics. So this was published in 2012, a decade ago. It's hard to believe. I remember when this was new. Nowhere does Meacham try to shoehorn in an analysis, for example, of Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, or insinuate that this or that political person of the hour is our next political savior or our next political antichrist. He also mercifully sticks to Jefferson's life and ideas, a feat which would be truly impressive in an aftermath of. He also tries to. He doesn't turn Jefferson into a saint, which would be harder to do in the light of Annette Gordon Reed's The Hemmingses of Monticello, an American Family, which came out just 4 years before this book did. That said, I don't think the brute fact of slavery, which is at the very center of The Hemmingses of Monticello by Gordon Reed, was discussed enough. Slavery should have been at maybe not the center, but at least more of the periphery of this book than it was. I would like to think I'm the last person to criticize historical figures out of what could be called a naive sense of presentism, but the fact that Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to use a triggering word here, so he did not romance Sally Hemings, okay? That was not a love affair. That was in all likelihood rape. When it is someone, when someone demands sexual acts of you and you can be killed for refusing them, that is not a love affair. That is not a romance. That's sexual violence. And we don't like to think of Thomas Jefferson in those terms. And I don't think he ever uses those words or phrases in reference to Jefferson, but sometimes the truth hurts, and that's what was going on, and and we need to be honest with ourselves about that. The fact that Thomas Jefferson sexually assaulted Sally Hemings and forced her to bear several of his children is a subject that deserves more than a passing glance. Sally Hemings is mentioned more than once or twice in here, but she is not a central figure, and especially considering she bore several of Jefferson's children, I think she deserves a much more vaunted place in the book. I don't think the fact that she was a slave means that she deserves any smaller of a place in the book. She is responsible for many of his progeny. So if we think about it like that, she's a very historically important person. Our failure to reconcile ourselves with things like this, with what happened to Sally Hemings, including the, it comes at our own peril, I think, including the continued idea, this sort of fascination with romantic ideas about the founding fathers' moral purity, and the idea that the United States is, going to be taken over by kindergarteners who are being taught critical race theory. I could go on and on, but it's important to confront things like this because it's, and I kind of knew that it might not, because there's a word I used later in the review. It's a very establishment kind of biography. It doesn't rock any boats. It doesn't call any major assumptions into question. It is sort of written through this art of power lens in which Meacham tries to show how Jefferson uses the psychology of personal relationships to influence others and the political ends that he wants to achieve. That, I think, is probably not terribly an insightful analysis about. That's probably true. Doesn't every really good politician do that? There's probably a pretty good argument that that's the case. This is what I would call a Jefferson starter biography. It will fill in the necessary gaps that you may not know, especially his early life, his education, how important, for example, some of the minor thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment were for him. But probably shouldn't be your final stop in reading about him if you're seriously interested in the guy. This is but hopefully one step on my way to eventually reading Henry Adams's History of the United States during the presidencies of Thomas Jefferson, and perhaps with time the total of Dumas Malone's 6-volume biography that was 35 or 40 years in the making, which I got 2 volumes of, by the way, at the library sale the other day, a few weeks ago. I will show that to you one day. Jefferson led a life that was just too eventful to have all of its depths plumbed in a single book. But this book reads like a serviceable, if establishment-drenched, entree into the more thorough and scholarly studies that I know are out there, like the Malone and the Henry Adams. So with that said, certainly not a waste of time, but kind of an entry-level biography. I'm glad I read it, but it kind of makes me want to read something even more, something that'll rock the boat a little bit more, maybe. John Meacham, Thomas Jefferson, and the Art of Power. I will see everyone next week.